Hey guys, it's Damien here. I thought I enjoyed the last little exercise in looking at color in comic books without looking really at whatever other things are going on in the comic book, but just the coloring. And I thought again I'd do a semi-random look mostly through comics I haven't read before that I'm about to read this week. But I thought I'd start with some old comics, kind of as a baseline. So here's a comic book from sometime in the 70s, Captain America and the Falcon, number 127. Nice beat up copy. I think this is one of the first Captain America comics I read. You can see, as we all know, the flat colors of the old comics. They were dealing with a really limited palette, and they basically just colored things in to separate the different images and make things clear most of the time what was going on. And they tried to give a little bit of variety in the backgrounds, a darker blue, a lighter blue. So I have to say it seemed, I don't know if I like the color of the African American skins, and of course all the skins are uniform. All the Caucasian people's skin is one color, all the black people's skin is another color. Yeah, you got some purple sky there. So there's a little variety in backgrounds, but there's a certain amount of literalness. Oops, that ad looks colored better in a way. But anyhow, you get the idea. And here's an interesting thing. Here is Omega Men from 1983. Really early on in the direct market, as it's called, the comic book store market. They started, DC and Marvel started putting out a few comics that were not for the newsstand, but just for the direct market. And they put them on higher quality paper, and I believe Omega Men was one of the first of these. I think they probably figured Omega Men was, this sort of science fiction superhero story was not gonna sell big enough numbers for the newsstand, but a higher price at the direct market, it might do better. And we've still got the flat colors, but it is on a higher quality paper, and they have a little more confidence that they can add a few different shades within the same figure. So sometimes we get a little bit of color highlighting where there's not just one flesh tone but two flesh tones. This is pretty ugly coloring to my mind, but it is just an example of, one of the first things that needed to happen for coloring to get better was better paper. And I suspect that this was still done with the same limited palette of colors. I'm not sure how many colors were allowed total. The colorist on this was Petra Goldberg, and that name seems really familiar. I think Petra probably colored a lot of comic books back in the day. And you can see on the cover it's an even nicer paper, and they went for even more, quote, sophisticated shading. There's probably 3 or 4 shades of grayish blue in this figure. Different shades of red in the fire. And then I believe this is 1988. Certainly the cover printing is of a very higher quality. I assume by then that's using on the covers using a press that a printing process that has a much wider range of colors. It gets almost a painted look. But inside we're still dealing with the old limited palette. This is on just slightly better paper, not as good as the Omega Men, but better than the old comics. And you can tell the colorist is working harder at the mood and feel, working with the artist a lot more. But still the kind of flat colors. There's a little yellow highlight there along with the flesh color. So we're getting slightly more sophisticated stuff. Very nice, sophisticated line work, they could count on this paper to show up the black lines a lot better and do more complicated inking and shading and such. And then my last of my old examples is an early Batman Legends of the Dark Knight, Grant Morrison and Klaus Jansson's Gothic, which I think went on to be somewhat of a classic. Still working with the limited color palette, but very much the colors working in concert with the story to really create the mood. And you can see here some shading. So yeah, the colors, I think there's, at this point we can see a much more awareness of color and story really going together. I don't know the history of all that. I think Lynn Varley, who did a lot of coloring with Frank Miller, may have pushed things towards that direction, and maybe Klaus Jansson himself, who did quite a bit of coloring when he, in his early days of inking Frank Miller. The colorist here is Steve Buccellato. So I think this was a colorist doing a really good job with the still fairly limited palette, although seeming somewhat expanded palette. But I don't really know. I would think this is still certainly pre-sophisticated kind of Photoshop, maybe a primitive Photoshop at the time. So you still don't get a whole lot of the shading and molding done by the colorist. But the colorist is doing a great job here of getting involved with the storytelling. So I just thought that was fun to look at. There's a little bit of extra shading done with the coloring there. So yeah, and then I'm just gonna skip to some books that I have bought recently, that most of whom I haven't read this one yet. So I'm just looking at the coloring, and I actually haven't done a lot of pre-looking. My first thought is I like a lot of this coloring, and I like kind of this movement from this bright sunrise or sunset color back here to the darker colors. The coloring definitely makes things interesting. There are places here where I find the coloring feels like it covers up. It's a little too dark. One thing I suspect with coloring in the age of computers is that the colorists and maybe even the editors and the artists are all looking at the finished product more on a computer screen than a printout. So they perhaps don't see exactly how much some of these colors obscure the artwork. This isn't too guilty of that, but there's just a little bit of that feeling of at times the color being a little too dark and making it hard for the eye to pick up the line work. And this is line work based art, most of all. So it's a little bit of a shame, but it's pretty good coloring. It definitely works with the story, and it keeps it lively and interesting. And here we have Batwoman. If I didn't know better, I would think the coloring by Batwoman was done by the artist J.H. Williams, because it's such a painted effect and it looks so good together. But in fact, this coloring is done by Dave Stewart, who I'm given to understand, particularly by Oddfellow Thoughts, but maybe from other people, is one of the preeminent colorists around. And this certainly is proof of that. The colorist acts totally in concert with the artist, with the line artist. So much so that it looks almost painted, and yet none of the line work is covered up or reduced in any way. So yeah, this is a case of beautiful coloring going with beautiful artwork. Given how great J.H. Williams' artwork is, it's really comforting to know that he has such a good colorist working with him in it, who's enhancing or at the least preserving the high quality of the artwork. But I think there's a lot of enhancement going on here. So, and each page has a mood and a feeling of its own, that both in the line artwork but in the coloring artwork too. My guess is, a colorist who's this good is truly an artist in his own right. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that he's a really good painter and such. So yeah, that's coloring at it, and think of how different that is from the old flat comic books. I mean, it's just worlds and worlds apart. So here's a bit of a ringer. Higher Earth 5. Higher Earth has been one of my favorite books, including in terms of its coloring. And here's the regular artist with the regular colorist. And that colorist is Andrew Crossley. So judging from the 4 issues of Higher Earth that I've seen him color, I think he's a magnificent colorist, who brings a lot of excitement to the color, keeps the story very clear, but just and manages to work with a very bright, almost cheerful palette, but create all kinds of moods with it. So yeah, to me, this is an excellent colorist. And then there was a fill-in artist with issue 5, and he came with his own, I suspect, fill-in colorist. And the color has a completely different feel to it. For one thing, to me, it's muddy. You can see that the colorist is working to kind of do a lot of shading with the color, a lot of molding, or there's some better word, modeling of the shapes of things, giving things more of a 3D effect. But it just doesn't work that well, for me anyway. It's a more muddy kind of thing. My eye kind of bounces off of it and slips around, and I can't always find my place in the picture. And the mood seems about the same from page to page to page. It's like the colorist is not paying that much attention to the storytelling, for me. I have a feeling that this is a kind of coloring that some people like a lot. And it might be a kind of coloring that if I were looking at the electronic version, I would like a little better too. But a lot of it must be the way you use Photoshop or something, I'm guessing, because there's gradations of color, but it just, for me, comes out as a muddiness and a haziness instead of whereas in some other colorists, like in the Dave Stewart coloring, it came out as vibrant and more alive, and this is more hazy. So I don't know what's going on there. So that was kind of my ringer of modern coloring that I don't like. And even though this is randomly picked other than those, it seems like most of the other coloring is very good. So when I kind of randomly pick amongst the comic books I'm getting, it feels like most coloring is actually really good these days. Here is Darwin Cook's Minutemen, and it is colored by Phil Noto. Oh, I believe Phil Noto is also often a penciler and inker, doing his own work. But this is great coloring. It evokes a kind of old-fashioned bright coloring, but it has a kind of palette you never would have really seen in those old comics, as we saw in those first 2 comics we looked at. And although it doesn't overwhelm you with the modeling and the shading, there is different shades and a sense of lighting in all these pictures, and a change of palettes as you move through the story. So, I mean, I think when you're working with such a good artist as Darwin Cook, you're probably inspired to do really good coloring anyway. But this colorist definitely steps up to the plate and gives us just the right kind of thing. I mean, it looks both simple and old and new and modern at the same time. Anyway, just flipping through here, it looks like a pretty intense, possibly depressing story. But beautifully colored. So yeah, thumbs up to Phil Noto for coloring there. Here we've got Daredevil. I love Samney's artwork, Chris Samney's artwork. And the colorist is Javier Rodriguez. My first thought looking at it is that it's a little closer to the more old-fashioned coloring. I mean, the palette is much richer, but there is a simpler feel, and maybe the colorist felt that fit with the artwork and the kind of simpler Bronze Age kind of storytelling approach that Mark Waid evokes, even though his storytelling is actually more complex. But in certain scenes, I mean, you see a sophisticated sense of lighting in these nighttime scenes and stuff. So while this isn't my most favorite coloring in the world, there's a lot of good stuff going on here. It's a little less than the very best colorists. It seems like it's a little less evoking them. You can't just look at all these pages and from the coloring and tell for sure what the mood is, and it doesn't quite seduce your eye as much as some of the other books do, some of the best ones do. But it seems like very good coloring to me. It seems almost like the colorist is struggling a bit with the bright red suit of Daredevil as it kind of pops out of every scene. But yeah, there's some very nice color choices here, though. So pretty good coloring by Javier Rodriguez. Maybe not my most favorite. Certainly nothing to be sneezed at. And I know that the coloring in Hawkeye is going to be a little unusual, as is the art. I have not read this issue either. We even get kind of a color palette on this introductory credit page where these color stripes match or complement the colors in these little boxes with the characters. Of course, first thing we look at is an ad. But here it seems like the coloring is kind of enhancing an almost woodcut look to the artwork, the old woodcut printing style. Oh, and you can see how the palette is changing with the scenery, with the scenes. There is very little in the way of modeling done here, but the color shades and choices are very modern. They're not old-fashioned, but the color matches the simplicity of the art to an extent. It's a flatter coloring. But I think very good color choices of contrast, so that things, even though there's a palette similarity, everything is layered properly and stands out properly. Nothing is obscured or lost. So this feels like coloring that, while it doesn't super excite me, is the right choice for the artwork. There is kind of a purple and brown thing going on here. Even the grays are a little purple. And in a way, my eye starts getting bored of those two dominant colors throughout. So, yeah, interesting. I think this is the kind of thing where when I'm reading it, maybe this particular comic might be just as good black and white as in color. I don't know. I'd have to read it in black and white to really be sure. But it may be less needing color than most comic book stories. Here's The Phantom Stranger. I have read this one. I'm not a big fan of it. But I thought the artwork and the coloring looked particularly good, and I think they actually, I think is it Phil Noto again? There's Philip Tan is credited as an embellisher rather than an inker, and just looking at it from comparing this art to the Brent Anderson art of the last issue, it looks like the inking, the embellishing is much stronger than normal in terms of affecting the style of it. So this has very appealing inking, and I'm getting off the subject, but I think this scratchy shaded inking style set the tone, and the colorist has really worked with that really well. And so the colorist and the embellisher together, I feel, improved the artwork of this greatly, just partially because I'm comparing it to the art of the previous issue, where the penciler was the same. But so I think this has very, very fine coloring, and would be a much duller experience without such good coloring. Yeah, look how beautifully colored these scenes are. So I didn't catch his name, the colorist, or her name. It's Ulysse Arundela, or Areola. Can't quite even make out the name. Not a colorist who I've ever noticed before. I think that's a woman's name. But a very good colorist. Look at all the different shades worked in there, but with the basically blue to red palette. Oops, be distracting looking at all the ads. But yeah, I don't know if it's the colors, probably the regular artist decision to pop that out in white. But just visually with the coloring and some of the other aspects of the artwork, this issue pops. And it was, thumbing through this issue and seeing the art, which is what got me to buy it, even though I didn't like the Zero issue, in hopes that I would like it more. So, excellent stuff. And probably also ending on a high note, this is the last one I've got in my little stack here. Batman and Robin. I think I always love the art in here, so I assume the coloring is good. And it is. It's kind of beautiful coloring. That's, just immediately seeing that, I see beautiful coloring. And the colorist is John Kalis. All these names that are hard to pronounce. So beautiful pencils and beautiful pencil and inks that are wonderfully complemented by the colors. And the colors really both feel consistent and seem to work with where the story is going at any given scene. But then, as I know because I have read this issue also, the artist changes. And the weird thing is that even though it's supposedly the same colorist, the coloring style completely changes. I have a feeling that it may have been colored by a different colorist, even though they don't credit it. Because here's the end of the main artist, and then the fill-in artist for the last few pages of the issues over here on the other side. And not only does the art style change, the coloring style changes. Even the color on Robin's face is all different. And the color in his costume is different. So if it's not a different colorist, he colored it at a very different time and didn't look back at what he was doing before, or maybe he just responded to the art he received and didn't think in terms of the holism of the issue. So it seems like the coloring, the big sin of this issue is where there's that break in the art style. It's very disconcerting, and it seems like the coloring accented that rather than perhaps covered that over a little bit. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know what it means. It's not bad coloring on this new artist, but it's in a different style. Very strange. Maybe it's possible that shows us how much the colorist responds to the style of the artwork he's working with. It could be for some other reason. Let me double check. Maybe there's another colorist listed. No, no other colorist listed. And John Calitz is listed as the colorist for the cover, which is nicely colored, if a bit monochromatic. Anyway, so this was me doing another look at color. I think I heard a few people refer to colorists as inkers, and the inker is almost always the person who actually lays a layer of black ink over the pencils. Probably when people say inker rather than colorist, they're just, it doesn't really matter to them. We all make little mistakes when talking quickly, but it might also be some people in the community who've only recently started reading comics may not be aware of who all the people are and what their roles are. So anyway, yeah, the colorist gets to it after the inker in general. Sometimes they skip over the inker nowadays, but generally you get the penciler drawing everything in pencils, then the colorist, then the inker laying down a coating of ink. Here in this case, we know that that's not the penciler style. A whole new style has been overlaid over the penciler by the inker, and then another sort of layer of the experience with the color. And the coloring almost always, I think, 99.9% of the time is done on Photoshop in a computer. Computer painting, you might say, in a lot of these cases. Okay guys, talk to y'all later.